Hey nerdy knitters, welcome to episode 3 of the Knitting 411 podcast, where we chat a bit about our knitting projects and we dive deep into your knitting related questions. We've got a lot to chat about in this episode. We'll talk about yarn stashes, an interesting article that's related to knitting that I found this week, and some of your questions, that confusing no stitch that you can see in knitting charts sometimes, how to switch out different increases, and how to read your stitches, something that's fundamental for every knitter to understand. But before we jump into today's episode, I just want to say hey and welcome you. I'm Tanya here at Nerdy Knitting. I'm a certified knitting instructor and a knitwear designer, and my goal is to help you become a confident, adventurous knitter. In our last episode, I shared a bit about my own knitting journey, and a few readers also shared theirs. I'd love to highlight them right now. I love this comment that Gail left. She learned to knit in 2015. She always said, when I retire, I'm going to learn to knit. And she did, and she knits every day. I just love that. And this comment from Emily, she started knitting about 10 years ago in her early 20s. She'd just taken a job that wasn't challenging, and she was allowed to watch TV and read books. So when she got home, she was at a loss because she'd done all of that during the day. She needed something at home that would keep her mind working, seeing she wasn't doing that at work. So sewing was great but expensive and something I had done as a child, so crochet and knitting was more of a challenge and much cheaper. Now I have a challenging job but still love to challenge myself at home too. I love these stories of people who learned to knit when they were adults. If you're one of those, be sure to leave a comment telling us about that. If you'd like to share more about when you started knitting, there's a poll over on the community tab of the Nerdy Knitting YouTube page. I'll put a link down below and it looks just like this. All you have to do is click on your age bracket and tell us when you started knitting. This week I thought we'd chat about yarn stashes. Are you a stasher? Are you not a stasher? Do you have lots of yarn? Do you have lots of space for yarn? I live in a pretty small house, so we don't have a lot of extra space, and I'm not really a stasher. I don't buy yarn unless I have a specific pattern in mind. That said, I do buy sock yarn and yarn for dishcloths, worsted weight cotton. Those are the two. I've got like a big gallon-sized Ziploc bag, and I just toss all of that I might buy of sock yarn or dishcloth yarn into one of those two bags because I usually have socks or a dishcloth on the go all the time. Those are easy to knit and just sort of mindless knitting for me. So I don't count that as stash, I guess, because it's just two Ziploc bags. It's still a stash, I suppose, but I don't keep a sweater's quantity of yarn unless I'm planning to knit a specific sweater, and then I buy the yarn for that sweater. Sometimes the pattern doesn't work out, and then I've got some yarn that I have to figure out what to do with or find a new sweater pattern for. But I do have sort of a leftover stash, and that gets divided up by yarn weight and also by fiber. Usually if there's enough of it for swatching, it goes into one bin that I keep. It's just a clear plastic bin with a lid, and I keep it in there. So if I'm planning to submit a design or work on a pattern or something, then I can pull out some yarn from there. It might not be the specific yarn I want to use, but I try to get one that's about the same weight and fiber content and swatch and get an idea of what I'd like to knit with it. And then anything smaller that I don't use for those goes into bags for blankets. I have one bag right now that's mostly just animal fibers, worsted weight. I do throw in DK and Sport, and if it feels thin, I'll just hold it double. And here, I had to get up for a second because I thought I'd show you what I knit with my leftover bits. I'm working on the stay-at-home blanket. It's worked in strips. And it's a great way to use up little scraps of yarn and create all these little houses. It's really cute. And when I have enough, then I'd make another little house and add to another swatch. So I don't really have stash here. I've got that leftover bin, and I keep sock yarn and dishcloth yarn. And then for most projects, I don't buy yarn until I need it for that specific project. I'd love to know if you're a stasher and how do you keep it organized? So I've been busy knitting. I've got a new video coming out this week with a linen stitch dishcloth pattern. That'll be out on Friday. You can get the pattern and all of that. They'll have information for that in Friday's video. I'll put it down below in this video too. And I worked on a hat. I had some Brooklyn Tweed Quarry, one skein of that. So I wanted to use all of it. I still have quite a bit left actually, because I thought it was getting quite big. I started in the center and worked down. I wanted to do a top-down hat, but I got lazy and did not switch needle sizes when I did the brim, and I'm not really liking the way it's flipping out, so I might rip it back and then redo that on smaller needles. And I might just add more length in the stockinette section because I still have quite a bit of yarn left, and I wanted to use as much yarn as I could for the hat because I wanted one of those double brims that you can fold over. It's a really nice woolly yarn that's nice and warm. So I like the hat pattern, but I'm a little bit of a perfectionist, so I think I'm going to rip it back and add more length in the stockinette section and then switch to smaller needles to do the brim. But I like working top down. That was really interesting. I used lifted increases. I don't know if you can see. It's my dark yarn. Sort of like if you were working a top-down raglan sweater, and I just did 4 increase points and created the brim of the hat. Came out really nice. It's nice and squishy and warm. But I want to make some changes to it before I turn it into a pattern. And speaking of hats, I'm working on a tam, and oh, this one is really driving me batty. I already knit this. I've knit this twice now. The first time I knit it, it was perfect, and I wore it, and the brim, I think because it's sort of a lace, it's a lace brim, it was really loose. So it kept sliding down my head, just enough that it was bugging me. So I figured, well, I'll rip it out and I'll just redo it, and I'll take out a repeat or two. I ended up taking out 2 repeats of the brim. And then, of course, that changed the stitch count for the body of the hat. So now it ended up more like a beanie, and I really wanted it a beret style. So I think I'm going to rip it out again and add in one of those repeats and maybe just switch down to a smaller needle size. I'd already gone down 1 size for the hat brim, but I think I might go down 2. Where it's lace, it's quite stretchy already. So I think I'll go down 2 needle sizes, and then I'm going to knit it. I think I did 2 inches of the brim. I might do 2.5 because I want it to stay on my head without moving, but I like the way a beret fits. I like the volume of a beret instead of a beanie. Beanies make me look like a bobblehead. So I'm still contemplating that, but I think I'm going to rip it out again. Good thing I like to knit, I guess. And use smaller needles and adjust the brim a little more. But it's a cute hat. It's just too small for my big head. And I've been working on the master knitting swatches. The first 6 swatches are all about different cast on and bind off techniques and about different increases and decreases that are a little more advanced, like twisted increases and decreases, double decreases, double increases. And the goal is to show different cast on and bind off methods while also showing those decreases. So these 2 are twisted decreases, full fashioned and blended. And all of that means is the way the decreases slant. Like in this one, this is considered blended because the decreases, well, they're twisted, so they're going to stand out anyway, but they follow the slant of the fabric. This is slanting in that direction. The decrease slants in that direction. Now, like this is a full fashion decrease where the decrease points towards the edge that it's worked at. And that just refers to, like, if you were looking at machine knit sweaters that are in the store, you'll often see those decreases that slant towards the edge that they're worked. That's full fashion decreases. And then there was the central decrease, which creates a line wherever you form it. And the left leaning decrease. I did some picots on that one. And then the central increase, which was a new one for me. Doesn't really slant, it's a double increase, but there's really not a slant to it. And I did an I-cord edge on that one. And the other ones are pretty basic. I did cable cast on and the crochet cast on. Let me see, on this one I did a lace cast on. That's really interesting, I like that. I might try that on a shawl next time. And then a yarn over bind off, which is really stretchy. So the goal of that was to demonstrate how to do all of these cast ons and bind offs, how to do the increases and the decreases. And then as part of it, we have to do research. So I had to research each of the techniques and I had to explain each of them in writing. So I don't know if you've ever had to write out how to It's easy to teach somebody to knit if you can sit there and hold their hands. It takes a little more thought to write out how to do something. And along with that, I'm working on my hat. I've been studying. I've got a couple of books. I've got this Farrell Motifs book that I'm using, and Alice Starmore's book of Farrell Knitting. She's got a section on designing hats and sweaters in here, so I've been studying that. And I've charted out a few different ways to do the hat. One with an 8-point top crown and one with a 7-point crown. So I don't know if you can see that. Oh, it's just a chart. I'm going to use that and sort of start sketching out some ideas for the borders and the peries and all of that. So that will be this week's project, and I'm going to start on the next batch of swatches as well. I've got some fancy stitch patterns to finish up, an elongated stitch pattern, mosaic, slip stitch, intarsia, I think. And I've got to write patterns for all those swatches, so in using charts and written directions. So that's the next part of the Master Knitting course that I'm working on. That's it for what's on my needles right now, and the rest of this week will be Master Knitting program and those two hats, that tam and this top-down hat. I'm going to rework both of those and get the pattern sorted out as well. And the scarves I mentioned last week, this pattern right here, the crenellated scarf, that will be coming out very shortly. And I'm just working out the pattern and getting the video ready for this one. This one's going to be all about reading written instructions and charts. If you are new to that, or if you need some practice with that, then the video and the pattern will really help in that department. I've been listening to a lot of audiobooks recently. I usually knit for a little bit in bed before I go to sleep, and I like to turn on an audiobook while I do. I just finished the first Discovery of Witches, and I'm on the third of the Outlander books, I think. I just started that one. Sort of comfort reading or listening, I guess, since I've already read both of those books, but I like them both, so I thought I'd listen to them again. And I'm always looking for new books to listen to. If you have a recommendation, be sure to leave it for me. And I read an interesting article this week, how knitters are making their favorite garments from pop culture. Of course, if you've ever knit a Doctor Who scarf, or the latest craze is Bernie Sanders mittens, then you know what I'm talking about. But sometimes when we're watching TV, I'll see something I like and I will make my husband pause so I can get pictures of it. And he laughs at me, and he commented that he thinks I'm the only person that does that. And the last time I had done this, I think we were watching an episode of The Mandalorian, and this sweater popped up. So I made him pause so I could grab a picture of that. It's actually mentioned in this article as well, which I thought was funny. But what was really funny is the next day I was scrolling through a Facebook knitting group, and somebody else posted that picture, and they were looking for a pattern that was based on that sweater. So of course I had to show my husband and tell him that I was not the only person who stopped TV shows so I could get pictures of knitted garments. And the article includes this interesting timeline that shows different garments throughout the last few decades that people have knit based on things that they've seen. Doctor Who's scarf, Princess Diana's black sheep sweater. More recently, the sweater that Chris Evans wore in the Knives Out movie, that one's been really popular. And like I said, the sweater from The Mandalorian, there's a lot of different things mentioned there. And it's an interesting article, so I've linked it down below if you want to go see what sort of pop culture things people are knitting. Now, before we move on to our knitting questions, I had a comment come in and wanted to know, how do you become a certified knitting instructor? So I thought I would answer that really quickly. I became a certified knitting instructor through the Knitting Guild Association. They have, along with their Master Hand Knitting program, they have the Professional Hand Knitter program, which is different than the Master Hand Knitter program. They also have certifications for technical editors, which I'm also certified for that, for knitting instructors, and even for knitting judges. So if you have ever submitted something to a fair or something like that, there are actually people who are certified to be judges for those events. So they offer that certification. So I took that course. They give you specific parameters you have to follow, and you develop different classes for different types of settings, like yarn festivals or yarn shops or big box stores. There's lots of different things that you have to do with that course, but they're not the only place that does certified knitting instructor courses. The Craft Yarn Council also has, I think, 2 or 3 different levels that you can complete to become a certified knitting instructor. I don't have any experience with that program though, but I'll put links to both of them down below. So if you're interested in learning more about what is involved in becoming a certified teacher, then you can check out those links. Now let's start our knitting questions section with last week's community question, Rachel's question about loose stitches when she starts knitting in the round again after working the sock heel. Now nobody left any responses to Rachel's question, but I did do a bit of research, and from my own experience with knitting socks as well, I know that when you knit a sock heel, sometimes you're slipping the stitches along the edges, and when you slip a stitch, you elongate that stitch. You make it longer than the rest. So a loose stitch along the edge could be that elongated stitch. It's just bigger than the other stitches to begin with. You also have the problem of that hole or gap when you start knitting in the round again. That's another common issue, and I think it's related to this. And one thing you can do with that is to use a make one to pick up the running bar between the two stitches, that elongated stitch and the stitch beside it. And that will tighten things up a little bit. And then on the next round, when you've added that extra stitch, you can just knit it together with the stitch beside it. And I think that might pull up some slack and help close up the hole and diminish the look of that elongated stitch as well. I know this is a problem for a lot of knitters, so we'll have to do some more research, and I'm going to save this question so we can ask it a later date when perhaps there's more sock knitters that can give us some more tips and ideas for that. Now, the first question this week is from Carmen. She doesn't understand the no stitch in a lace knitting chart. And this is such a common thing. I remember the first time I saw that, I thought I had to slip the next stitch on my needle and just do the next thing that was going on the next stitch, and that really messed things up. But all a no stitch means on a chart, you can see one right here, it's just a placeholder. It's there for stitches that will be there eventually to fill in the rest of that chart, or it's there because you've reduced the amount of stitches and it's the place where there used to be stitches. I think charts can be a little confusing because we equate each box on a chart with a stitch on our needles, and that's not always the case, because sometimes a box might involve 2, 3, even more stitches. I think you need to change your mindset about what each box on the chart, what it represents. Instead of thinking of it as a stitch, think of each box as representing the next action you have to take. If we look at row 1 of this chart, there's a gray box and then a second gray box. Those are no stitch, no action. We just move to the next box. We don't do anything to anything on our needles. We don't do anything to the stitches on our needles for those first 2 boxes. We just move our eyes right across to that third column, and that tells us it involves 1 stitch, and the action for that stitch is to purl it. So that's what we do to what's on our needles. We just ignore that gray no stitch. I know this is really confusing, but once you get your head wrapped around it, that's just a placeholder, it's not involving anything on your stitches, and you start to think of a chart as each box represents an action that must be taken. For example, in row 12, that center stitch right there, that's 1 box, but you're using 3 stitches to perform that action. Now, another way to look at this no stitch is to compare it to the written instructions. These are the written instructions for that chart. And if we look at row 1, look at what it says. It says knit 3, purl 3, knit 3. That's all it says. There's no mention of a no stitch, of gray boxes, nothing like that. It's just telling you what you have to do. And that's exactly what this chart is telling you to do. It's telling you to knit 3, to purl 3, and to knit 3 again. Remember, it's a wrong side row, so those black dots represent knit stitches on a wrong side row. So I hope that addresses your question, Carmen. I hope that explanation helps you understand what's happening with that no stitch box. Nothing's happening. It's just a placeholder for stitches that will be there later on, or for stitches that were there and now they are gone. You're not doing anything with them. They don't correspond to anything on your needles. You just move right over to the next box and continue doing the actions that each box tells you to do. If you're still finding it confusing, compare the chart in your pattern to the written instructions, and you'll see that those written instructions just pertain to the actions happening in each of those boxes, and they don't mention no stitches at all. Our next question is from Sue Elizabeth. She wants to know more about the position of the stitches on the needle. Sometimes she can tell when something feels off, but she doesn't quite understand what is happening. She mentions the trajectory of the stitches, and that is a really good term to use because a stitch is made up of 3 parts, a head and 2 legs, and that right leg is really the trajectory you need to pay attention to. That leading leg is telling you how that stitch is sitting on the needle and how it should be worked. There's a few things to understand here: how a stitch is formed, how you insert your needle, and how you wrap your yarn. And we're going to look at all of them in this demonstration right here. When you're a knitter, one of the most important things you can do is learn to understand how stitches are formed. Stitches are simply loops that are woven together using your needles. This would be 2 stitches. They're just simple loops that are formed. And then on the next row, you have more loops that are formed, and enter these loops and sort of lock them in place. But we start with just 1 stitch. This is a stitch. It has a head, and it has 2 legs, a right leg and a left leg. We call the right leg the leading leg because it leads to the next stitch. And this is the leg we want to work into. No matter how the stitch sits on our needle, this is the leg we're working into. When you knit a stitch, you enter from the front between those 2 legs, you grab the yarn with your needle, you pull it through, and you form a new stitch. And now this is the stitch that's on your needle. And this stitch is now finished and it's closed up. And you can see the head of the stitch is now pushed behind the legs of our new stitch. And that would be repeated down here. The legs would be pulled together and they would be in front of the head of the stitch below. So when you see a stitch like this, especially in stockinette, then you see all of these little V's are just stitches. The heads are to the back. That's what we see on the reverse stockinette. We see all of the heads of those stitches. They're pushed to the back, and we see the right and left legs pushed together to form a V. That's all that's happening right here. And purling is just the opposite. Instead of inserting from the front, we come from behind and insert our needle this way. We grab our yarn, which is in the front of the work, and pull it through to the back. And this new stitch, what's happening here? We can see these legs are now covering the legs of that stitch, and the head is now exposed on this side. So when you have reverse stockinette fabric, this is why you see all of those heads of the stitches. You're seeing all of them along the back of the work right here. That's our reverse stockinette. So when you purl a stitch and you pull that through, the head of the stitch is brought forward. The legs of the stitch are hidden in behind the new stitch. So no matter whether we're knitting or purling, we're entering between the legs, both legs of the stitch in the center. When you're knitting, you come in from the front, grab your yarn and pull it through. When you're purling, you're coming from behind, usually off to the side on this leg right here, but you're still coming between the legs, grabbing the new yarn from the front, pulling it through to the back. This is really the foundational thing you need to understand. The head of the stitch, the legs of the stitch, and the right leg is called our leading leg because this is the leg we are going to knit into. This leads right into the next part, how the stitch sits on the needle. It can sit this way. You can see the left leg is in behind. The right leg is in the front. Our leading leg sits on the front of the needle. This is usually referred to as the Western stitch mount, which is common in North America, Europe, Australia, New Zealand. Most knitters will mount the stitches in this manner with that leading right leg on the front of our needle. But you can also have the stitch sit this way on the needle, where the left leg is in the front and the right leg, the leading leg, is in behind. And this is usually referred to as an Eastern stitch mount. But no matter how the stitch sits on the needle, you want to knit into the center of this stitch. So let's look at the Western mount first. When our stitch sits like this and we're using our needle to knit another stitch, we come in from this direction and we draw our yarn through that way. If we're using an Eastern mount, our stitch sits like this. Now when the stitch sits on the needle this way, to knit a stitch, we knit through what they call through the back leg. The leading leg is in the back. So we're still going to insert between the stitches, but we're coming from this direction to pull our yarn through. But no matter how it sits, you want to go into the center of that stitch. Now, if you're in this position and you're knitting through the back leg to form the normal stitch, if you knit in a Western method where you're knitting through the front leg, our front leg here is our left leg. If we knit into this stitch and pull it off our needle and the new stitch comes through, this is what happens. We end up with a twisted stitch. Those legs have been twisted closed. And you might want that if a pattern calls for it, but in general, you want that stitch to remain open. There's a stitch beneath and a stitch above, but those two legs are still separated. But if it's sitting on your needle like this, in the Eastern stitch mount, and instead of knitting through the back leg, you knit like you would for a Western stitch mount, that stitch is going to twist. And this can also happen if your stitch is seated in the Western stitch mount as well. A normal stitch, we enter this way and knit. If it's sitting like this and you are an Eastern knitter and you knit through the back leg, you come from this direction and you knit, this is what happens. You twist that stitch closed. So if you find your stitches are twisted, it's because you're not knitting through the center of that stitch. It really doesn't matter how it's seated on your needle. What matters is where you're knitting into. You could have a combination of Eastern and Western mounts across the stitches on your needle, and you just want to make sure you're knitting through the center. So if it's sitting this way with that leading leg in the back, you knit through that back leg to keep those legs untwisted. If it's sitting this way on your needle, then you need to knit in the standard Western position. You're still going through the center of the legs to maintain an untwisted stitch. So how does a stitch end up on your needle like this? And how does it end up on your needle like that? Because sometimes you could have them in either direction. It depends on how you wrap the yarn to form the new stitch. So we're going to have to switch to our knitting for this part. Okay, on my needle I have standard Western mounted stitches right there. So to knit one of these, we insert into that leading leg, which is sitting in the front, and I wrap my yarn. Think of the point of your needle like a clock. For a Western mounted stitch, we wrap the yarn counterclockwise or anti-clockwise. We're coming around, wrapping that yarn, holding it there, pulling it through. And that's all. And when you look here, you can look at that stitch and you can see it's maintaining that Western stitch mount. There's the head on the top and there's two legs. Our left leg is in behind and our right leading leg is sitting on the front of the needle. That is because we've wrapped the yarn counterclockwise when we pulled it through. Now, even though I'm in a Western mounted position, I can make an Eastern mounted stitch by the way I wrap my yarn. If I look at the point of my needle as a clock, and instead of wrapping counterclockwise, I wrap clockwise and pull it through, look at what happens to that stitch. Now we have that leading leg is in the back. The yarn's coming through and we have a left leg in the front now. I know it's harder to see here, but that stitch has the left leg in the front, the right leg in the back. And that is formed because of the way we wrapped our yarn. We wrapped it clockwise and pulled it through. And now it's mounted in an Eastern position. So if I were to come to that on the next row, I'm knitting along and I can see that stitch doesn't look like my other stitches. It's because that leading leg, that right leg, is in the back. What I can do is I can slip it to the needle, slip it knitwise, and then back over, and that reseats the stitch, but there's really no reason to do that. let's say it was this stitch right here. All I need to do, if I'm maintaining my open stitches, they're not twisted. You can see underneath, if I pull the legs of the stitches apart, there's lots of space in there. Those legs are not twisted together. If I had a stitch like that, where that leading leg's in the back, and I knit it through the front, I'm twisting it. Now look at that stitch. That left leg is now twisted over the right leg. We've twisted it because we've worked it like it was a Western mounted stitch instead of the Eastern mounted stitch it is. If you have that on your needle, you make sure you're knitting through the center of the stitch. No matter how it's seated on your needle, you're knitting through both legs into the center. And we call this knitting through the back leg or back loop, and that keeps that stitch open. So those are the things to be aware of. How a stitch is formed. That leading leg is the most important part. How it's sitting on the needle, whether the leg is in the front or in the back. Where you're inserting your needle. You always want to insert into the center of the stitch. You don't want to insert over here and twist. You don't want to insert over here and twist. You're always inserting into the center, no matter how it's seated on your needle. And you're paying attention to how you're wrapping your yarn. You can wrap it in either direction. You just want to pay attention to how that stitch ends up on your needle. So I hope that cleared up a little confusion about Western mounted stitches and Eastern mounted stitches, and how no matter how it sits on your needle, how you have to knit that stitch right into the center of the stitch, no matter where that right leg sits. It's very common to have a combination of Eastern and Western mounted stitches on your needles. This is called combination knitting, where you might knit in one direction, but you purl, you wrap the yarn in a different direction. It's actually a good thing to combine methods sometimes. I like to do a combination method when I'm doing rib patterns because I find that it helps. You know that last column of knit stitches that always seems to be a little bit bigger? Combination knitting, when I create my purl stitch, I wrap the yarn in the Eastern method, and that tightens things up a little bit. So once you understand how these stitches sit on your needle, how they should be worked, and how you wrap the yarn to create the stitches, you can combine the two methods whenever you're knitting. Now, the last question this week is from Julie. She wants to know if she can replace a yarn over with a KFB. And the quick answer is yes, you can certainly replace one increase with another, but there is something you need to be aware of. Yarn overs and make ones are worked between stitches. So you knit a stitch, you work the yarn over or the make one, and then you work the next stitch. But if you're replacing it with a KFB, you have to remember that you are actually increasing in a stitch. You're knitting the stitch and then knitting into the back of that same stitch to create the increase. So this can change how you increase evenly across a row. If a pattern tells you without specifying how to increase evenly across a row, you have to work that out for yourself. Or if you're changing one of the increases, it's going to change how you work the increase. For example, let's say these V's are all knit stitches and I'm knitting across the row and I want to put an increase. I want to knit two and end increase. That's what my pattern says. So I knit two and I work an increase right here. A yarn over or make one. I knit two, I work an increase. I knit two, I work an increase. I knit two, I work an increase, and I do that across the row. And that's where my increases would be placed. Now, if I decided to replace those yarn overs or those make ones with a KFB, this is what happens. I knit two and I make an increase in this stitch. I knit two, I make an increase. I knit two, I make an increase. I knit two, I make an increase. Can you see how that displaces your increase stitches? It's not the same. They're not a one-for-one replacement. In this little section, we have 6 yarn over increases, but we were only able to work 5 of our KFB increases. And it changes where they're placed. At first, they're similar, but as we get over, we can see how they have moved. So that's something to be aware of if you're replacing a yarn over or a make one with a KFB. You have to remember that a KFB is worked into a stitch and not between stitches. So you're consuming a stitch. You're taking one stitch and turning it into 2. So if you were going to use that knit 2, make an increase, you would want to think of your when you're doing it for KFB, knit 2, but in that second stitch, make your increase right here. And then knit 2, but make your increase in that second stitch. Knit 2, make your increase in that second stitch. And that would line it up better than it would if you just tried to knit 2 and then use the third stitch to make your increase. So the simple answer is yes, your increases are interchangeable, but you have to pay attention to how they're worked. Are they worked between 2 stitches or are they worked in a stitch? And that will change how you place them. Now for our final question of the week, our community question where I need you to give us some advice and some tips. We don't have a question that was submitted this week, but I did find one in a Facebook group I'm in, so I thought that it would be a fun question to ask. What unpopular knitting opinions do you have? Do you never swatch no matter what you're knitting? Do you always swatch? Both of those can be unpopular with certain crowds. Do you never block? I'd love to know what opinions you have about your knitting habits that you think other people would find unpopular. So look down below in the pinned comments and leave your answer there and tell us about your unpopular knitting opinions, and I will share your answers in our next video. Now that's it for this episode. If you have a question that you'd love to see answered in an upcoming episode, you can leave it down below in the comments or hop on over to the Nerdy Knitting community page, look for this picture and the date for the next episode and leave your question right there. And be sure to come back for the next episode to see what unpopular opinions and knitting questions we'll be answering next.